Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies, where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome back to the show writer and film critic Jonathan Rosenbaum, and today we're discussing one of his recent books, Travels in the Cities of Cinema, Conversations with Ehsan Khoshbakht. Jonathan, welcome back. Great to have you again.
Thank you. Thank you. The title, by the way, is Ehsan's. I think it's a really good title, but he was the one who thought of it.
I love the title. It's perfect since, of course, yeah, travels you in the cities of cinema since you live now in Chicago, but of course New York, where you're from in Alabama, Paris, London. So it's we learn so much about you as well. I know you have Moving Places, another memoir, which I haven't read yet, but I plan to. Was this more revealing of yourself than that book?
No, I think in some ways Moving Places reveals as much or more, but of course it was done half as it came out in 1980, so that's a long time ago, and I've had a lot of life since then. My whole, career at the Reader came after, long after that book. So it's because I basically started at the Reader in 1987, so 7 years after that book came out.
And what was there anything like did he ask you anything that was sort of like, oh God, I don't want to go there, or anything that was emotionally challenging, or were you just game for anything?
There was some that was emotionally challenging, but there wasn't anything that I don't recall there was anything that I said, please don't ask me this. Uh, I think what was tricky, of course, is that he was asking me about my relationships with a couple of people who were very important to me, but also problematic. Like I don't know if I have to call him a former friend, Adrian Martin, who's one of my favorite people, who basically decided he didn't want to be friends with me anymore, and I had to talk about that. And also, even more, the whole issue about Manny Farber,
Mm.
who is to me the greatest of all American film critics and a huge influence on me, and yet at the same time, not a person I liked as a person. I mean, who I think I was treated rather badly by him in a lot of ways, but who I still value enormously as a inspiration and a touchstone regarding for film criticism.
Does
But
it
no, I think I was there weren't any areas where I said, no, no, you can't ask me a question. But of course, Asan is very discreet anyway. I don't think he would have gone into any kind of sort of like offensive areas. I already knew that. That's one of the reasons I was the one who selected him to interview me, because I was approached by this wonderful press, Sticking Place Books, and Paul Cronin, is basically wants to do it. He's doing a series of book length interviews with film critics. And the first was not one he did himself, but which he translated, one with Michel Simon, the late editor of Positif. So this book is the second. I believe the third, which is coming out actually next month, is James Nairmore, who's a very good friend of mine and my favorite academic film critic, actually, at least my favorite American academic film critic.
Mhm. Yeah, he
And there'll be many, many more, I'm sure, that'll be coming up. So I think it sounds to me like it'll be a very interesting series. And I know that Jim Nairmore's book is much longer than mine and is going to be probably quite different from mine, actually, because I think it has a lot of illustrations and stuff, for example.
right. What can you talk a little bit about how the process of working with Asan worked? Like, did you edit the interviews afterwards, or how did you both work on this together?
Well, we did a little bit of editing, but we didn't, I don't think we needed to do a lot because he was I don't we did most of it the way where I'm talking to you. I mean, like on Zoom, we would talk
Right.
to a large extent because he's based in London. actually. And so he was was doing his end of it in London. So we had to arrange times that, where where it was possible to do it that way. Some of it we did, in terms of the editing, we did that through email. And, so that was part of it was email and part of it was Zoom.
Okay. Was there anything that he wanted to include that you wanted cut out? Was there any any disagreements about what to include and what not to include?
No, none that I can remember that come to mind, certainly. No, I think we had pretty much the same. I mean, he decided to write the introduction, which is very nice. I mean, and very flattering to me. And I think, but we had previously done two joint efforts, which we had published. One of which was on my 70th birthday, he had a dialogue with me about jazz and film. And that's included in my previous book, you know, In
Yeah.
Dreams Begin Responsibilities, a Jonathan Rosenbaum reader, or rather an abbreviated version of it. And then also when Kiarostami died, he proposed that we have a dialogue about Kiarostami, which we did. And as I recall, it was when I think I was in Paris when we did it, actually. Well, I wasn't in Chicago, but anyway, I can't remember if we did it through email or exactly how it was done. But we had those two, and in fact, he borrowed a few things about Kiarostami from the Kiarostami dialogue to include in our interview. He just sort of was kind of like match cut, did a kind of like match cut, so that they became part of this book. So I think he did he did a very thoughtful job of, insofar as he did the arranging. I mean, I think that what the section headings and the titles of the chapters and so on was basically his doing.
And I was interested in the fact that you talked about as a when you were 12 or 13 you lost your religion. What made you become a non-believer, so to speak?
Well, that's the first chapter of my book, Moving Places: A Life at the Movies, deals with that.
Ah,
I mean, I'll give you a brief synopsis of what happened. Um, I was I don't know, it's true, I was very religious. But then around the time when I was 11, well, first of all, I saw this movie called Bird of Paradise, not the King Vidor version, which was silent, but the sound version in the early 50s that Delmer Daves, and, it had Deborah Paget, Jeff Chandler, and so on. And it was a kind of a very upsetting movie to me because it ended with a native Tahitian, I guess, or South Sea Islander sacrificing that there's a volcano on her island that's erupting, and it's because she's actually had a romantic relationship with a white man, actually.
oh,
And it's almost like God is angry about this. And in order to appease the anger of the God, she had to sacrifice herself by leaping into the volcano, committing suicide. And as soon as she does that, it ends the volcano erupting. So I was just sort of totally freaked out by that whole idea of, making a sacrifice like that, and a kind of a tribal sacrifice. And it was around the same time that my older brother David, who's no longer alive now and died tragically, actually, but in any case, he was having his bar mitzvah, like at the age of 13, and I was 11.
right.
And that influenced this nightmare I had one night, a nightmare in which my entire family was going to drown itself in the lake.
Hmm.
That was the only, I don't remember much of it except that was, like the main thing. And I suddenly thought, how can I have such a blasphemous dream? Why is God enabling me to have a dream like this, or letting me have it? And so my father, who always stayed up late in his study reading, so I woke up and I went to his study and he was there. And I told him about it and how badly I felt. And I discovered for the first time that my father was an atheist. he hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted to influence me and my brothers. But and it's very ironic because he was even taught at my Sunday school at the Reformed Temple in my hometown in Alabama. But but anyway, I was really shocked to find out that he was an atheist or an
Mm.
agnostic at the very least. And but as a result of him telling me this and of me sort of like questioning him about his beliefs, it caused me to lose my own religious belief because I was very much influenced by him
Mm.
throughout my whole life. I mean, my father wanted to be a professional writer and wasn't able to make it. So in some ways, my whole destiny as a writer was fulfilling what was he wanted to be his destiny.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
anyway, that's how I lost my religious faith.
Mm. And
And it's the first chapter. The first chapter of Moving Places is called, it's actually got other sections in it, but it's called The Plucking of Three Birds of Paradise, actually. So it's, it's kind of hard to describe, but but only one part of it is about the movie Bird of Paradise. It's also other questions about movies and how they affect our lives, because that's what the book is really about how my life was. Because my family was, my grandfather ran a chain of movie theaters in northwestern Alabama. And so I could see everything for free, and I would spend almost the major part of my childhood at the movies in my downtown in the town I was from, Florence, Alabama. There were three movie theaters that were all owned by the Rosenbaum family.
right.
And they were each about, over just a block radius, so I could walk from one to the other even.
Mm.
And it would be, and I could just walk in the theaters. I didn't have to, everybody knew who I was. So it was a kind of, and also I think my parents didn't discourage it because it was almost like, but my brothers went a lot too, but not as much as me. But it was like I went to movies, so that became my babysitter in a way.
Well,
They didn't have to worry about it. I was at the
right, they knew
movies.
where you were.
And I should say that I originally thought I was going to go into the family business, except that in 1960, when I was 17, or was 60, no, it was 60, the business finally got sold by my grandfather, and he retired. And then my father went and taught English and American literature at the local college after that. So it all ended with, when I was about 17.
Mm. And
Although, I mean, I still went to movies afterwards, but
right,
yeah,
right,
go ahead.
yeah, right. But you didn't need the babysitter anymore at that at that point. Luckily, you weren't five or something when that happened. You
Yeah, right.
One thing you talked about how the a tour theory was important at one time because they made people see that someone like Hitchcock was a serious artist. Do you think the tour theory is still important?
Yes, I do think it is because, for example, I just yesterday saw a French documentary that's really terrific about Boulanger, the French actress.
Oh yeah.
And it convinced me that, it treats her like an auteur, which she was in a certain way. So it's not just that she was a great actress. She wrote at least a couple of her major films, or helped her write some of the major films she was in, specifically with Jacques Rivette. I mean, L'Homme Fou and Celine and Julie Go Boating and Northbridge or Le Pont du Nord. She co-wrote all those films. And also she chose to make films with directors she admired who were not always who were often not all that commercial. I mean, Rivette was, obviously uncommercial in certain ways, and I don't know, she was very there's an interesting comparison made in the film between her and Jean-Pierre Léaud because they were both sort of like ideal team players. It's like for the Nouvelle Vague. Although, as Marguerite Duras once said, Bula is not Nouvelle Vague, she's totally vague, actually, or absolutely vague. And the funny thing is, the vagueness I interpret it as part of her technique is a kind of way of making the audience creative and sort of like understanding her characters because she kind of leaves out certain things. She plays mysterious characters in certain ways.
Mm,
And so she's a quite a, and also I knew I've spent, not she wasn't a friend or anything, but because I was around during the shooting of a couple of Rivette's films,
right.
and my best friend, and when I lived in Paris, was a screenwriter who actually became a director and also used her in, I think at least two of his films,
Oh,
maybe even
wow.
more than two. So I saw a bit of her, and I was in awe of her. I thought she is still to this day, I think, my favorite French actress. So the very fact that this was a work of criticism, this documentary, and that it was treating her as an auteur, is a good example of sort of like why I think this distinction, can still be important, because the idea of yes, directors are creative, but there are other people who are creative, and so the whole term of auteur, as it was used in England and the United States, or in an Anglo-American use of the term auteur, when of course in French it just means author, but I mean, it's a concept that I think we still have and still means a lot.
Is it more useful perhaps for it to be like a tour theory, like to look at it from multiple perspectives as opposed to what commonly commonly is that people look just at through the lens of the director? Because that seems
Yes, no,
what
it
people
is. And of course, I use it more often for directors and for other
right.
people, but because, there's some actors who are auteurs and some who are not. And
Hmm.
it's partly ones that have, play a creative role. For instance, one thing that had a creative and even critical role that played by Boulanger, which I discovered, I mean, I think I half knew it, but I wasn't sure that she actually had played so decisive a role. The film that she made called Le Pont du Nord, North Bridge,
Yeah.
which is made co-stars her and her daughter Pascal, who died fairly tragically not long after the film was made. The whole idea she had for the film is she had played a Fassbinder film called The Third Generation, where she plays a terrorist.
Oh, right.
And then who gets, I think, arrested, and then she thinks, well, what if I play the character after she gets out of prison? And so in other words, I think the whole film was started and launched by her proposing that to Rivette. So that gives her, a really literally makes her just an author, not just an actor in terms of her own role. And
Right.
even part of the idea is, she has a certain kind of claustrophobia, the character. So the entire film was filmed in exteriors. There are no interiors in the whole film.
Right.
So, it's sort of the things that grew out of it are all these sort of like aesthetic decisions about how the film was made. And they can be traced back to her. So, I mean, I think
Hmm.
that's kind of like, in other words, a good application, I think, of the term auteur.
Well, speaking of Fassbinder, I thought it was interesting that you said his films feel like a tug of war between Marxism and sadism, with sadism winning.
Yes.
Can you give an example of what of a film of his where you really see that, or is it just all of his movies?
Well, I think there's a defeatism in his films.
Right.
It's almost like, in other words, there's very pessimistic films. They're basically saying that everything is hopeless.
That's
And
true.
it seems to me, an anti-Marxist position, but it also has to do with, sadism is about power, and audiences are fascinated by power. And in fact, the big tragedy that we're living through now as well, people of the United States, is that we have a person who's so obsessed with power that power is more important to him in terms of image and all of this than anything else, not even in terms of the quality of our lives. That doesn't matter. It's
Right.
only about his power. that we're all his subjects, and we're all supposed to be his slaves now. And anyway, it seems to me that that's, can be traced back to the way in which sadism is about, power exerting itself, one person having power over other people,
Mm,
and in terms of that sadism. So yeah, I think that that's partly what I'm talking about. And of course, I don't know. It seems to me that there was something, you know, as a director, Fassbender was very manipulated, and this, as with Warhol, I mean, he exploited a lot of people.
mm,
His entourage consisted of, people who were in some ways his slaves. And
right.
in some ways, he was patterning himself after, you know, um, Warhol, and there were parallels, all the drug taking, all the homosexuality, it's like there are certain ways in which, so it seems to me, a perfect example of what I mean about sadism being more important than Marxism is one of his better films, which is called, in English, it has different Fist Fight for Freedom. It's also called, I'm trying to think the other titles it has, but it's about, and where he plays this sort of like victim hero who gets abused by by his lover. And there's a shot early in the film where the camera is almost like on the ground, waiting for him to fall down when he's falling down. So it's almost like the camera is appreciating and enjoying his defeat
Mm,
because it's already there on the floor waiting for him to fall down before he falls down. So that's kind of what I mean,
see.
that that's certainly not Marxist. It's like that's sadism.
Is that Fox and his friends? That sounds like, or
Fox and his friends. Yeah, thank you.
okay.
Yeah, I should have thought of it. It's my old age that where, you get these temporary memory losses. Yes, of course.
I also wanted to touch a little bit about Orson Welles because I love The Other Side of the Wind. I know you have mixed feelings about it, and you worked on it, of course, as an advisor. But you talked about how the Houston character you didn't feel that it was believable that his character would make this kind of art film. But what I always took it as that he was trying to just fit in with the young generation, and so he's mimicking them. Um, it,
Yes. No,
yeah,
I think that was the motivation.
right,
I'm just saying the character that we see, because Houston himself was interested in making art films, and the real John Huston. So I mean, and he did make films that can qualify as art films, but I'm just saying that as a character in this film, he's not entirely believable, or and also that the film within the film is what becomes hard to believe, because in other words, that he would make a film in which the leading character, played by El Kadar, is a Native American playing him. And in other words, I don't even think when people see the film within the film, they think of it that way. But that's really with the way
oh,
conceptually, because the woman herself, Oya Kodar, who co-wrote the film and, co-stars in it, is a good friend of mine
yeah.
in very poor health, I'm sorry to say,
Uh,
but so I've talked with her a lot about the film and what their own ideas were about it, so it's like, so I just think that, I didn't even pick up on that idea totally right away. It was something I had to kind of like
oh,
figure out. And one way you could interpret it that I argue is that throughout Wells' career, it's starting with Citizen Kane, Wells saw human behavior as a kind of mystery that we can't solve. And,
that's
even the idea of not being able to figure out Charles Foster Kane is part of that.
right.
So we could sort of like say the fact that Jake Hannaford is, mysterious and unfathomable is consistent with Wells' other films in some ways.
That's true. Yeah.
It's not so, but I'm just sort of like saying at the same time, in terms of how the film registers, I have to say that part of what makes it difficult, my mixed feelings about the film, is that I don't approve of a lot of the decisions that were made by the people who had the final decision on the editing,
Right.
almost all of whom but one were Hollywood people,
Right.
Hollywood directors, including Bogdanovich and Frank Marshall, and only one of them, sort of the Polish producer, who lives in Chicago. He was not, but the point is that the sound editing of certain films, I saw, the way they originally were, and I thought that the scenes were much more, particularly there's a gay baiting sequence,
Oh, yeah.
when a person, you know, that was such a powerful scene, and it made me and everybody else in the audience squirm.
Mm,
Maybe it still does, but
yeah.
they thought it was absolutely necessary that they add the sound of a tinkling piano from another room
Right.
that
Right.
really made it less confrontational. And that was very upsetting to me. So
Right.
I guess I explained that on the book, but
Yeah.
but there were other changes they made because it was edited like a Hollywood film when the whole film is an anti-Hollywood film. So
Right.
it seems to me that it was edited by people who didn't understand the film, I think, to a large extent,
What was the
in my
point?
opinion.
What was the point of putting the piano sound?
Because I think you heard the piano in other scenes.
Oh, so
In other words,
what do you think?
but hell, they could have included the sound of slamming a door. I
Right.
did everything in my power to convince them to not do that. And
Right.
they just said, we tried and it didn't work. That's all they said. When they said it didn't work, I
Mm,
don't even know what they meant by that, except that it maybe said that their sense of continuity, which of course, to me was sort of like of no significance at all. What was really significance was these close-ups between Houston and the guy who's playing, the former teacher, who, by the way, was also in the star of Wells' TV pilot, The Fountain of Youth, the same actor.
oh, right. I didn't know that.
Having trouble remembering his name now. But anyway, it was sort of like it was what made you squirm was these close-ups of
Yeah.
the extreme discomfort of both Jake Hannaford and the school teacher. It's like they don't know how to react to each other. And I think the audience has made part of that into part of that discomfort. And it's become now you watch it much more from in a safe distance, because somehow the piano and coming in the background normalizes it. It just makes it, it's whereas this was the only thing happening and the sequence as well as edited it.
Mm,
And that's why I believed it. But, I think there was a lot of ways in which there was 40 minutes of the film edited by Wells, and they didn't leave his editing alone. There's a long sex sequence in a car, which is I don't know. They eliminated maybe 2 minutes of Wells' edit from it, which I just think I don't know. It's just sort of an atrocity in my opinion to do that. Plus the fact that this has never come out on DVD, and the reason why it may never come out on DVD is that Criterion has an exclusive contract with Netflix, and they decided they're not bringing it out. Now, I don't know why they decided not bringing it out, but I suspect because Criterion has become very PC lately, that it has to do with, Oya Kadar. Well, thinking that it was sort of like Oya Kadar playing a Native American, that's a no-no. But on the other hand, Criterion has brought out Touch of Evil, which I also worked on as a consultant, in terms of that version, and they don't have any problem with the fact that Charlton Heston plays a Mexican, So in other words, it's like 20 years from now or 30 years from now, maybe they'll say it's okay. So it becomes a kind of, if that's the reason. I'm only guessing because I don't know why they decided against bringing it out.
yeah.
But it does seem to me really unfortunate that they're making it impossible for anybody else to have a DVD of it by not bringing it out because of the exclusive deal with Netflix.
Mm. Did they bring out Touch of Evil? I thought it was Kino who did Touch of Evil.
Maybe they did, but I thought that there was an earlier edition.
Oh,
Maybe I'm
maybe,
wrong.
maybe I'll look it
But
up.
at least, but anyway, Kino did. Maybe they didn't bring out Touch of Evil. I can't remember now if no. Maybe I'm mistaken about that. But what I'm saying is there are plenty of older films that are politically
Yeah,
incorrect that
for
they
sure,
distribute
for sure.
in any case.
Yeah, I get maybe because it's a fresh film, they feel they get criticized for it, and it's more comfortable to put it out if it's an older film, perhaps.
Yeah, but but even that's not true because after all, most of the film was shot around 1970, and that's a
Well,
long
yeah,
time
yeah,
ago.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I mean, it's sort of like I mean that part of what makes the film so difficult is the question of that timing. I don't think it's the same kind of issue with Don Quixote, which by the way I do consider a more important film of Wells, although what was done to that by Jesus Franco was far worse than what any Hollywood
Yeah.
you know, studio did to Wells' work. It's the big the work. If I had to sort of pick the worst Wells release because of that was destroyed, it would have been the version edited by Jesus Franco. I'm happy to report, by the way, that Don Quixote is being transferred, which is still, she won various lawsuits, and Oya Kodar has all of the Quixote footage, and it's going to a Spanish Cinematheque, so
Oh,
a
wow.
film archive. So it's
Oh,
going to be preserved, and we might be able to see. The biggest problem of the Jesus Franco version wasn't his own fault. Wells basically thought because he couldn't do enough footage with Patty McCormick to complete that part that he had to discard all that footage. Unfortunately, I've seen most of that footage or a lot of it, and it's the best footage of Don Quixote. It's the
hmm.
greatest part, which was all done in Mexico very shortly after Touch of Evil. When he actually left during post production, it was to go to Mexico City where he shot the beginning of, where he shot a lot of the footage for Don Quixote with Luis Buñuel's son as his assistant
Oh,
director, by
wow.
the way.
Oh, wow.
Uh, that includes the Franco version because unfortunately Oya Kodar, when she was feeling very desperate because it was during the Bosnian War.
Mm.
And she was trying to keep her parents alive, and in order to keep her parents alive, she had to keep moving them, and she didn't have enough money. So, in order to get enough money, she sold the rights to the film to Spanish Expo,
Oh, I didn't know that.
and
Hmm.
and yeah, and that's why. And she didn't. All she knew about Jesus Franco was that he was assistant director on Chimes at Midnight. So she thought, well, that's okay. She didn't know he was the biggest hack in world cinema, actually. So anyway, that's why it's such a bad version, I think.
Well,
So
I look forward to that then. If that's gonna come out, that'll and so it's
yeah,
gonna
I don't
be
know. Well,
edited
the
and
thing is,
everything.
I don't
Like,
know exactly how they're going to present it or what they're going to do, but the point is it's going to be preserved and they'll have it and the people will be able to see all the footage. So in some form or in some way, hopefully.
okay.
Because I mean the guy who just recently was the head of the Barcelona Film Archive is one of the great Spanish Welsh scholars. So I mean,
Wow, wow.
it's obviously the best place for it. In other words, or it may, I don't know if it's going to that archive. It may go to the Madrid Film Archive. I'm a little uncertain about it, but my friend Catherine Benamu has been kind of following what's been going on and sending and giving me reports on it. So
Okay.
it's all happening now. It's in process right now, actually.
Okay. Well, I look forward to that. Last question I had was, you often talk about how you consider Manny Farber the best American film critic. Yet I thought it was interesting that you said you didn't like him personally. Does that ever make it hard for you to read a writer that you admire but yet don't like personally? Is it hard to then enjoy their work?
Well, it plays a role of complicating it, but I don't think one has to agree with the taste or I mean, actually, I there were some points of disagreement with Farber because, for example, he liked the new German cinema much more than I did, and including Fassbinder and Herzog, for example, he was much higher on them than I was. But that wasn't a real obstacle to me. What I think that was really important for me about Manny Farber is that he considers film criticism an art form because I considered myself a literary writer long before I became a film critic.
Right.
And that's something I'm moving back towards because I feel that I no longer feel comfortable working with academic presses for reasons that I explain,
Yeah.
like in this interview book.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, Farber was hired me to replace him for 2 quarters at University of California, San Diego, but then I didn't get rehired, which was okay because I wasn't a very good teacher then. But the real problem is he felt that he was in competition with me, which is insane.
Mm.
I mean, it wasn't a logical thing, but there's a certain kind of way. And see, I recognize this as sort of a Jewish sibling rivalry. I don't know how Jewish it is, but I grew up with three brothers. He grew up with two brothers. And, they were all, in both cases, we were very much in competition with our other brothers for our parents' attention and approval. And I felt that he kind of like suffered from that syndrome. And then I suffered from it because, I couldn't get him. I wanted to show him my first book, Moving Places, while I was working on it. And I lent it to him and his wife, and then he returned it. After I lent it to his wife, he returned it and said, "Sorry, we're too busy." And then finally, the only way I got her to read part of it is she had to come over to my place and read it, sitting across from me. She couldn't even read it at home because he obviously, and it's a book that's quite different, totally different from anything that Manny Farber did. But maybe for that reason, because it was, it's a sort of I guess I don't want to be pretentious about it. And people who don't like the book, moving is considered pretentious, but it's an experimental avant-garde work, and very much in a lot of different ways. And for some reason, I mean, he told me years later that he he liked the book, but he didn't like it as much as my criticism.
Mm.
Because he also was very bothered by there's a lot of stuff about being Jewish and he liked to avoid stuff about that. And somehow he kind of like was in flight from that.
Mm.
And I guess he didn't like, after all, he was born with the name Emmanuel, which is something I think he felt very uncomfortable with.
Wow.
So there was all of that, but the point is that I wrote this essay about him, which I think is one of my best pieces called "The Drive-By Night: The Criticism of Manny Farber."
Yeah.
And I showed it to him before it was published in my first collection, and he made some corrections, and which I, accepted. But then when the book came out, he decided he didn't want to be talk to me anymore. So there were about 3 years in which he refused to talk to me or return my phone calls or anything.
Mm.
And when I asked why, the only word I got back is it's one thing seeing something in a manuscript and another thing seeing in a book. But I mean, what could I do about that? He basically approved what I showed him, but then he refused to talk to me for several years. And then eventually he said, he treated me badly and he apologized, but it was still, it was the wounds never
Right.
healed entirely. And he wanted me to fly all the way out to California at my expense to go to a late art show of his. But when I had traveled great distances in the past to attend lectures of him or to attend art shows, I got treated badly. I mean, I went all the way from Chicago to New York to go to a lecture of his, and I didn't even get invited to have dinner with him afterwards. I wasn't part of that crowd. So that's why I did. That's what the reason for my dislike.
Mm.
His neurotic behavior, really, about me.
Hmm.
Anyway, sorry to go on about this,
No,
but
no, no,
I'm
no.
just trying to make the situation comprehensible.
Right,
Uh,
right. No, I know it's
so it was obviously complicated.
yeah, it's complex. But like I said, it's a wonderful book for anyone interested. It's called Travels in the Cities of Cinema: Conversations with I always get Ehsan Khoshbakht, and it is out from Sticking Place Books. So I'll leave the link in the description box for where you can order it. And I guess it's pretty accessible elsewhere, right, Jonathan? If people want to get the book.
Yeah, yeah, it can easily be ordered, and it's a fairly it's much. it's much more cheaper to buy, and of course shorter than my previous book, a collection, which is kind of a more like a magnum opus, and Dreams Begin,
Yeah.
which, by the way, I'm happy to say is getting reprinted in September,
Oh,
actually.
great.
So it's
Congratulations.
up like sold out. It's practically sold out its first edition already.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, so I'm really glad of that. I only had reviews, one in Sight and Sound and one in Cineast. Both, by the way, I'm happy to say, rave reviews.
Oh,
But
great.
it's sort of like, but most, so many film magazines have disappeared. It's like it's very hard to get film books reviewed, which is why I'm so grateful to you for being so attentive to my work, actually.
Oh, my pleasure. No, I enjoyed.
And I feel like you're a good reader and you understand my books, and so I'm very grateful for that.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. No, I really liked In Dreams Begin Responsibilities as well. And I interviewed Jonathan about that. So the link will be in the description box if people want to listen to my interview with or watch my interview with Jonathan. And of course, now you have another book out, Camera Movements That Confound Us. We haven't talked about that yet, but we're planning on scheduling
Yeah,
something.
that's published also by Sticky Place Books, and they both came
Yes,
out this year. Both the interview book and that came out. Both came out this spring, actually.
yes, yes.
So it's kind of unusual for me to have three. I've actually the three books come out in less than a year's time. I'm kind of it. I didn't plan it this way, but I'm glad it worked out that way.
Busy man. Well, we will plan something soon for that. But Jonathan, thanks again for coming on, and I look forward to having you back.
Well, thanks, Robert. Yeah, you take care. Bye.
Take care. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. You can also leave a donation or what I call a tip by clicking the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on that and you can leave a donation if you choose to. Of course, I would greatly appreciate that. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movie logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that. And then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new videos. I would also really appreciate if you leave a comment, share the video, like the video. All of these things create traction onto my YouTube channel and really help share the video far and wide and the channel in general. So thank you so much for doing that, and I will see you all in the next one.